This is Jeffrey Sachs, editor of Tradition, with another episode of the Tradition Podcast. Visit traditiononline.org to keep up to date with everything happening in the Journal of Orthodox Jewish Thought, both in the pages of our print edition as well as the regular digital offerings published on the website a few times a week. In 1953, Yale theologian H. Richard Niebuhr was asked, to what extent did religious and specifically Christian convictions influence the development of American democracy? And to what extent can that democracy be maintained in America or be reproduced elsewhere without the aid of such convictions? In response, Niebuhr put forward a theory of America as a covenantal community, a model built on trust and the unspoken voluntary promise on the part of each member of the covenant that every decision one makes will be in the interests of enhancing the commonweal. Recently, Daniel Friedman reflected on the trajectory of Niebuhr's covenant idea and how it influenced the thought of the late Rabbi Jonathan Sacks. Friedman did this as part of our Rabbi Sacks Bookshelves Project, a weekly column exploring some of the great writings in Western philosophy, history, literature, social science, and more, which left their mark on Rabbi Sacks's writing. Visit our website to sample the offerings in that series. Friedman's essay was authored and slated for publication weeks ago, but the production schedule meant it was coincidentally, perhaps fortuitously, published in the days following the recent unfortunate and unprecedented events in Washington, D.C. In light of those events, we thought it would be informative to chat with him about civil discourse and the critical importance in binding the wounds of our society. He recently spoke with our associate editor, Rabbi Chaim Strauchler, who is responsible for the Rabbi Sacks Bookshelf Project. Together, they consider practical applications for the concepts advanced by Niebuhr and by Rabbi Sacks in specifically not othering our neighbors. Rabbi Daniel Friedman is the senior rabbi of Hampstead Garden Suburb Synagogue in London and is completing a doctorate on American Christian attitudes to Israel. Here's the conversation.
Dan, it's a pleasure to be able to speak with you about issues of politics, issues of society, issues of thought coming out of the thinking of Richard Niebuhr and Rabbi Jonathan Sacks.
It's an honor to be part of this Tradition podcast. Thank you.
Excellent, excellent. So you published a piece with Tradition online, The Idea of Covenant American Democracy, a review of Richard Niebuhr's work and how it was taken by Rabbi Sacks in his writings. And I'd like you to apply some of this to what it is that we're going through as a society now in terms of our politics and the presence or the absence of covenants. And to some degree, what would Rabbi Jonathan Sacks say to this moment? So why don't we start with that? What would Rabbi Jonathan Sacks say? And I know that to some degree he did speak about it in his book, Moralities, specifically towards the end of the book, when he really emphasized covenant, as you noted in your article. But more has happened since he passed away. What would Rabbi Jonathan Sacks say?
So I think that Rabbi Sacks's thought really evolved through his books. You see that he begins with the notion of covenant and a covenantal society from H. Richard Niebuhr, from his 1953 essay. But then as you look, and that begins in his book, The House We Built Together, The Home We Built Together, where he talks about how can different immigrants come to a country and be able to build a society. And he decides that the model must be the model which was the original American model of migrants coming from everywhere and building a society, because they took this covenantal idea from the Bible and applied it to a society that was not a society based on contract, based on what can a state do for me, based on what can the markets do for me. Instead, they said, what can we contribute to make our society a more livable place for everyone? And as he progressed through his works, he not only used Richard Niebuhr's ideas, he used other works on the origins of American society. Other scholars were dealing with those questions as well along the way, contemporary scholars as well, and until he finally concluded this idea, like you say, in his latest, almost magnum opus, Morality, where he brought together all of his ideas, and he says it's really all one idea. All of these thoughts that I've been developing throughout my works across the years, it's a similar concept, just applied in different ways. And he applies all of those things from cancel culture to loneliness to how do we deal with migration issues? How do we deal with civil society? How do we deal with civility? One thing after another. And he says that the answer is covenant. The answer is that we need to move from a mode of thinking that is an I, individualistic mode of thinking, to a we mode of thinking. There are modes of thinking that say, let's rely on the state to provide everything, nationalism. There are other modes of thinking that say, no, it's all about me and the individual rights. And he says in between we have that society, and that's really what holds us all together. And if we can build society, then that's the key ingredient. Now, he would say today that society, and he did say it, society has broken down. We've forgotten what we had learned, what we had developed, these biblical ideas, these biblical values, what he thought that he could apply from the Bible to modern society, even in the absence of necessarily biblical values, have gone in a way that he wasn't expecting. He thought that it wasn't beyond hope and that they can be reinstilled in society.
So I want to drill it down on that exact point they just raised about God. And we say in America, e pluribus unum, that there's this ability to bring out of the many, create a one. And there is within that idea certain religious themes as well that are also conveyed with the in God we trust. And the question that Niebuhr seems to emphasize is that God needs to be part of the equation. If for Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, he takes this idea of covenant and prescribes it for a society that he does not expect faith in God to necessarily be critical for this idea of a we. And the question I'd like to pose to you is, who's right, Niebuhr or Rabbi Jonathan Sacks?
So Rabbi Sacks already developed the concept of Brit beyond a Ben Adam Lamakom, between us and God relationship. You know, we think of Brit beginning with God and Noah, and then God and Abraham, and then God and Bnei Israel. But he says, if you look a little deeper, there is a covenant that begins to develop between us and our fellow human beings, embedded in the Torah. We have, when we stand at the foot of Mount Aval and Mount Gerizim, and we say, blessed be the man who follows this, cursed be the man who follows that, and we answer Amen. So the Gemara tells us, and the Tosfos develops it, to say that Amen was a commitment, not just to what we're going to do, but when it says that Arur Ha'ish Asher Lo Yakim, cursed be the man who doesn't uphold these values and this commitment, and we said Amen to that, that's a commitment to uphold the values on behalf of our fellow Jews, that we are responsible. That's the basis of Kol Yisrael Arevim Zelazeh. We're responsible for one another. But the Tosfos says that at that moment, we all made covenants, multiple covenants with one another for all of the mitzvahs. And what Rabbi Sacks wants to do is to say that that covenantal society that we developed as an Israelite society, like later Jewish society, was adopted and adapted by American founders as the model for American society. And that worked. And if it worked then, it should be able to be equally applicable to modern society, whether that be in America today, whether that be in Britain today, or anywhere else, a society whereby we have a covenant to be responsible for one another, to make sure that it's not just survival of the fittest. We are working for the greater good, for the collective good. Every decision that I make, every action that I take is not just about, is it good for me and my own family? Is it good for everyone? Is it good for the society that I've chosen to be a part of because I have a covenant with them too?
So in regards to this idea of covenant in our political moment right now, what sorts of things can an individual do to create more of a societal covenant, where there seems to be such a broad idea? Would there be some masa mitzvah, some practical thing that Rabbi Sacks might point to and say, hey, do this to be more we and less I?
So I think Rabbi Sacks would say, he doesn't spell it out like this, but I think what he would say is, one has to approach every decision as seeing the forest for the trees. Let's take the most glaring, obvious example of the last week, Rahman al-Islam, that's been really heartbreaking to certainly all Americans. I know you're certainly originally an American, may have voted in these elections. But really to Western civilization, and I would say the entire world, we've all been very upset, aggrieved by what we saw last week at the Capitol. And I think you have to ask yourself, so all right, so let's say from the other person's perspective, because Rabbi Sacks would always say, ask yourself, put yourself in the other person's shoes. If you want to be able to create a covenant, you have to know what they're thinking. And he quotes Abraham Lincoln, and this will stay with me forever. Let me give you the Lincoln quote, which is, he wrote it as a note during the middle of the Civil War, and he called it a meditation on the divine will. Lincoln wrote, "The will of God prevails. In great contests, each party claims to act in accordance with the will of God. Both may be and one must be wrong." Let me repeat that line. Both may be and one must be wrong. In other words, if they're working in contradiction to one another, then they can't both be the will of God. Both, at least one of them must be wrong, and maybe both of them may be wrong. God cannot be for and against the same thing at the same time. In the present civil war, it is quite possible that God's purpose is something different from the purpose of either part. So I think the first thing that each of us needs to do in terms of coming from a place of humility in order to create this covenantal society is to try to place ourselves in these shoes and in the mind of the other person. You can't have a conversation until you can discern what exactly are they saying, right? The first level of covenant that Rabbi Sacks refers to often is marriage, right? So anytime you have spouses that are not seeing eye to eye, as a rabbi, one asks them, well, how about you start to repeat what the other person's saying and ask them, is that what you were saying, right? You want to be able to at least know that they're hearing, that they're listening to one another. And unfortunately, that's broken down in society. So for starters, we need to be able to hear what the other person's saying. So let's say, for argument's sake, that there was a case to be made that the election was unjust, that there were certain things that weren't heeded, and things weren't absolutely right. Even if that were true, when I say that we need to see the forest for the trees, one has to ask oneself, if that's true, and I'm going to shout that till the cows come home, what effect is that going to have? What's going to be the consequences? Sometimes, just like in any argument that one has, breakdown in a relationship, one has to ask oneself, okay, I might win this battle, but lose the war. And I think we saw that very clearly. If we're looking to build a society that is built on a collective morality, as he calls it, a collective set of values, where we believe in democracy, we believe that there's certain things that just don't happen, we don't attack our own capital. right? We used to know who the enemy was, right? The enemy at one point, Germany, Japan, Saudi Arabia, they've all managed to become our best friends now. Instead, who are our worst enemies? Well, if I'm a Democrat, then it's the Republicans. If I'm a Republican, then it's the Democrats. How did that happen? These are your family members. These are your neighbors. These are your kinsmen, fellow Americans. They're meant to be your best friends. How did it happen that they're now the enemy? Clearly something's broken down. And if whatever I'm saying and whatever I'm claiming is leading and assisting that breakdown, then I'm breaking down the covenant, and I've lost the plot somewhere there. I'll give you a great example of where I think there's a turning point. And I want to try and take any politics out of this, because I'm not making a statement either way. President Trump brings Nigel Farage, a polarizing character, to say the least, in this country. Head originally of UKIP and then the Brexit Party, successfully did pull off Brexit, I mean, obviously along with the Conservative Party in this country, but he brings them to a rally and he allows them to address this Republican rally. But I ask myself, why? Why? I mean, is he part of your team? Why is your Democratic cousin not part of your team? Who are we having a conversation with? I mean, one side accuses the other side of being globalist, but we're playing the same games. If it needs to start with my family. Rabbi Sacks is very into family. Why? Because we have our first allegiance is strong family, then strong civil society based on associations, religious groups. These are the groups that I'm contributing to. My largest form of identity in a positive way, because he distinguishes between identity that's used both by the right and the left in order to pull society apart, but in a positive way when we're talking about a positive identity, because he says identity is natural to our human instinct and our human endeavors. When we think about, if I'm looking to build America, then I need to be having a conversation with Americans. I don't have allegiances and alliances with people who are like-minded in other countries. That doesn't make any sense. Instead, I need to be asking myself, am I talking to my family? And even if we disagree, and that's very strong in his point of morality. You know, I think about the video that Arnold Schwarzenegger put out. And some people, anytime they hear any connection to the Holocaust or any allusion or any usage of the Holocaust, they say that's absolutely off limits. Well, is it? Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. But we need to be able to have a conversation that's a mature conversation. We don't simply dismiss the other person because, well, I have certain rules of engagement. And no, it's a conversation. I might not agree with what you're saying or the tools that you're using, but as long as we're having a conversation, we have to understand that that's what families do. Sibling rivalry used to be a model of how we should act beyond our families. Unfortunately, even within families now, we've reached a point where we need to say, you know, there can't be sibling rivalry. We can agree, but at the end of the day, we're still family. And that's what society is based on. That's what covenant is based on. Families don't just break down. Covenants mean that we're tied together by something. We're bound together by something that's stronger than simply a contract of what's in it for me and what's in it for you.
This itself becomes a bit of a nuance between Niebuhr and Rabbi Sacks, and that's Niebuhr speaks about the universalism of Christianity to create almost a worldwide expectation for where covenant needs to exist. That's almost like a family of humanity. Whereas Rabbi Sacks seems to be more invested in certainly the nation state, but perhaps also in religious identities that is very much rooted in Judaism. And I think that there's a lot of tension around these ideas, specifically in the politics of the moment, where there is a lot of Niebuhr's influence in terms of this commonality across borders that is interrupting the family identity within those borders?
Yeah, so I think that Niebuhr struggles. Niebuhr was asked the question, is the American model sustainable and applicable beyond America? And as a Christian who believes in the universalism or potential universalism of Christianity, how far do you go? I mean, if everybody is my brother, then I've no particular responsibility to one person over another, and that becomes, it's not a bad thing. Ultimately, we have to care for all humanity, but there's no concentric circles that I'm building. I think a good example is Natan Sharansky's idea in his book on democracy, where he says that in order to be able to essentially be an Or LaGoyim, you need to know who you are as a goy, as a nation yourself, and then you have that strong identity, and that identity you can then, I think maybe it's the book Identity, you can then take that strong identity and be able to use it as a vehicle for spreading goodness, right? When see, American exceptionalism is probably the best example, can be used for good purposes or for nefarious purposes, unfortunately. I think the founders thought of it as a city on a hill used for good purposes, right? Obviously, it is complicated because there was a lot of Christian thought built into it. But I think over time, the notion of American nationalism was separated out in the minds of many Americans from Christian American nationalism, but American nationalism, American exceptionalism as a force for good in the world, right? And it gets complicated, and it's not an easy concept, and especially in a postmodern era where one asks, is your model better than my model? Right? But these are valid questions, but questions that if we believe, instead of retreating and say, well, I just don't know anymore, and I'm not going to stand up for what's right, or I'm going to universalize everything and fight about it even within my borders, that's not the right way to go. I think that ultimately Judaism does have a strong model. Like you say, Rabbi Sacks's model was a particularistic model. It certainly starts with us as Jews being an oligarchy, but he wanted to apply it to, I mean, he used it for Britain, but I think the same thing would apply to any country today. I think an interesting point that we find, I don't know if this has been your experience in Canada. It certainly was my experience, 16 years in Canada, and my experience in Australia as well. As a multicultural society, Rabbi Sacks isn't very fond of the multicultural idea. I think it has worked in certain countries like Canada and Australia, countries that have built this identity based on multiculturalism, that the multiculturalism is not something that is derech agav, tangential, as a second thought. It's something that's built into, this is our identity of who we are, and we value it. It's a value that my Judaism is who I am as a Canadian, Australian, and it could be like that as well as a Brit or an American, if it were weaved in the right way. But I think the key that Rabbi Sacks says, and he mentions this, emphasizes it in the final chapter. He says, all too often we wait for strong leaders to be able to direct us on a path like this. He says, no, it begins with us. It begins with every individual. Right? Because of the nature of its argument of covenants and building society, building associations, every one of us, every time that we do this and say, you know what, family member, I don't agree with you, but I love you. And I'm going to not only pay lip service, I'm going to shower you with love and kindness despite our disagreements. And if we had that attitude with our neighbors and with everyone, and especially people who don't agree with us politically, if we now double down on our kindness and graciousness and willingness to help and not other them, right? You know, we think about the idea of "Ahavta l'reacha kamocha." And what does that mean? Love your fellow as yourself. You know what it means? It means don't other them, don't demonize them just because they don't agree with you, right? They're your neighbors, you know, our fellow Americans, Canadians, Brits. Right? Love them, appreciate them, and understand. And I think that the greatest problem that we have right now is, and Rabbi Sacks stresses this, is it's not enough simply to disagree with someone, but we have to, if we disagree with them, then society says that we need to dehumanize them, demonize them, say that, you know, you are ad hominem attacks, you are something that should be canceled, that is less than perfect because you have a different opinion. When we have that, then there's no discussion, there's no dialogue, there's no communication, and there's no covenant. And that's what we're lacking. We need to build people up and not put them down or denigrate them.
So it really becomes, to create that that covenant requires us to look at the other as part of ourselves. And that's something that we each can do as individuals.
Absolutely.
So one last question to close our conversation. Rabbi Sacks was all about hope. That was something that he spoke about in many of his books. So what hopeful message in light of the current political situation can you offer, whether it be in the name of Rabbi Dan Friedman or in the name of Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, to give us some hope in this difficult time?
So, you know, Rabbi Sacks talks about history being linear as opposed to cyclical. That's a strong thought of his. But at the same time, in his book Morality, he does say we're not beyond hope. This is not a book of doom and gloom. I really do have great faith in what can be. And there's always a tug of war. There's always a push and pull. We go through moments historically, like Rabbi Sacks refers to, you know, in the 90s, we thought in Fukuyama's was that it was the end of history, that we'd reach that moment of enlightenment and we all got it. And then we regressed, but that's what life is about. You know, a couple of steps forward, a step backwards. And we shouldn't think that just because we've seen events that we never thought we would see during our lifetimes, that it's all over and it's irreparable. We will fix things. Sometimes we need a moment of introspection, something that wakes us up, jolts us and says, you know, where did we go wrong? And hopefully if we are all awakened by that moment and be willing to start to begin to listen to others, you know, this may be an important turning point for the good for all societies around the world to make this world a better place for everyone.
Amen. Yasher koach, Rabbi Friedman, thank you so much for this, and yasher koach on your important work. We had the opportunity to see better covenants and better societies. Yasher koach.
Amen. Thank you. Thank you for having me.